We're going to talk about soybeans with the lowest prices over the year and yet the lower cattle cattle herd stocks in the United States. Right here on Connected Farmer, your channel to keep you up to date with the latest trends in agriculture and livestock. So, Jerry, we had closed on Friday with the lowest price for soybeans in the year. So, what's going on? One of the major issues was the deal in the Black Sea.
Yes, well, this week was really a tough one here. We had a combination uh, of the the wheat report that really was pretty. The individual reports we were catching up on the social media and that looked at some pretty tough crops, pretty thin crops. The yields they were coming up with were 8, 9, or 10 bushels less than a year ago, and year ago's levels were below the 5-year average. So, but the market. I guess yesterday, when we finally got the finalized number coming out on the U.S. Wheat production number, the 30 bushel number that they came up with for the state of Kansas was 1 bushel higher than the USDA's number the week before. So I don't know. People thought that meant that the things were in great shape. If you really start looking at the actual number that the trade people that were on it, they were actually making the assumption that the USDA's harvested number was probably 600 to 650,000 acres less than the USDA was using at 6.6. It was like 5.95, something like that. From there, so I don't know. The twist of it is that the last day of the report, the samplings they had on the last really half a day, that was you go from Wichita back to Manhattan, they all want to catch planes to get back out of there or drive back to Kansas City and catch a plane, things like that. And so it's a situation where I think this last day of sampling kind of over influenced the number, because really the eastern third of Kansas is not really where the wheat crop is at. It's in the western 2/3, and it's really west of I-35 if you drive that line through the state of Kansas. And so that being said, the action here today, it was kind of follow through situations, primarily because of the technicals, and that unfortunately our investors are not totally connected with our fundamental news. They are really connected, unfortunately, to the technical price action and that. And so when the markets yesterday kind of fell through the 200-day moving average in Kansas City July wheat, the market followed through even before we even got the last numbers that we got yesterday afternoon. And then today, it was more of the same. As we got people basically, even after a little bit of strength overnight, and which is always kind of bad news when you end up having a short Kelvin rally overnight. It tends to eliminate then people actually, of all things, they turn around and sell it back in as the day goes on. And so that's part of the reason wheat was in kind of our downside leader here this week, when you'd think that the situation here in the U.S. should be looked upon as something that's going to make the world tighter on wheat. And the interesting twist about it, the wheat that is and the tour that we had here in Kansas is really reflecting red wheat, which is the most direct, relatively speaking, to the U.S. consumer. And so at this point, I've told some people that this isn't the summer. We're going to have cheap bread prices here at your local grocer because right now, at least, there's even some talk that there's maybe even having more than normal wheat coming from Canada, but people don't realize that even Alberta out there is having a very dry spring here at this point, and there's been smoke from fires up there that's actually impacted the Midwest, and even today there was a hazy situation here in Chicago.
Yes, and another thing that happened over the week, new data from Buenos Aires saying that the crop in Argentina will be reduced once again.
Yes, the Buenos Aires Exchange, they were the high side of the 22.5 to the 21.5 numbers between them and Rosario, and they ratcheted down their number to 21, 500,000 metric tons below Rosario. And they were up around 63, 65%, I think we saw in that report. And that's really interesting about with the USDA staying at 67 last week, which caused a lot of head scratching, mine included. And that I heard reports that the actual ag department in Argentina, which hadn't been updating their numbers, had dropped their number to 27 million earlier last week. Didn't even make the news wires to even get that number out here to us. But the USDA, and I guess deference to the Argentinian ag department, stayed with their 27 because of that. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that's the way to make a decision about a crop size in a country, particularly when the exchanges are really the primary ones that are following the crop size in Argentina for sure. So, so that's despite that, we've I think that helped actually kind of bounce things overnight, but then turned around and the beans got beat up today just as the wheat did because of poor technical situations there where that market took out things overnight and tumbled too, just because of the fact that we're not at Memorial Day weekend, but the market sometimes doesn't really the investors have to look at it in the fact that if it's not going up and it's going through my stop, I'm out. So that's really what happened here in both beans and wheat.
Yes, and another thing impacting the protein world is that the U.S. cattle herd has reduced another time, and it's the lowest herd in the last 50 years.
Yes. Unfortunately, the impact of not so much this year's drought as it was the last 2 years one out in the western plains and out in Montana and Wyoming, where there's a lot of feeder cattle stock in that. Basically, over the last 2.5 years, we've really had a huge reduction in the available supplies of feeder cattle, which are the offspring of our cow herd. And even the cow herd's been beat up. This week's numbers here at 96.5% or thereabouts were slightly above the average trade guess, but very, very small. Same thing on the numbers of feeder cattle going into the feed yards, and our slaughter numbers were there. So the interesting thing about that is that reduces our corn demand, no doubt. But the one tricky thing about it is that sometimes during this summer period here in the areas in the Great Plains, because really you'd think the cattle would be raised in Iowa and Illinois where all the corn's at. Well, they're raised in Kansas, Texas, and Nebraska, and those three states are the big three of cattle raising at this point. And so they during the summertime will feed wheat because it's usually cheaper, it's available, that type of thing. Well, we had very minimal wheat feeding last year, and we're going to have the same situation again this year. So the idea that corn feeding, even with the smaller numbers, will all of a sudden decline because big time in cattle raising is probably minimal at this point. It's not going to be, huge increase by any means, but it's a scenario where the alternatives, there's not anything else you can feed. If you can't feed the wheat locally or the sorghum or things like that they raise out in the Western Plains, they're going to look at corn. I just heard today that there's been some trains starting to be organized to move corn. I would have to say, really, Illinois and Indiana, the train connections seem to be better from those areas into the Kansas area and even into the Texas area, that there might be some corn moving in that direction going forward. But that sure didn't help the corn prices this week, as we both know.
Yes, and what are you expecting for next week?
Well, next week is an interesting one. We've still the one thing we didn't touch on, we probably should quickly here, is the fact that the Russians at the last minute decided that they would go ahead and extend the Black Sea corridor for another 60 days. It's going to be a lopsided deal here. They basically, as we're going into the end of this year, it turns out that a lot of boats were not, didn't even go in. And actually, I heard interestingly enough here and some of the is that the Russians agreed to only 2 ports and not 3 ports at this point for shipping things out of Ukraine. They just continue to nickel and dime this thing left and right. But in general, that scenario is another factor why this market kind of gave up the ghost on wheat and corn, which are the 2 primary things that Ukraine gets shipped out of there. Even the amount of plantings looks like there's getting down to about 80%, 85% of the plantings, but their total number of acres or hectares are going to be down. So in those cases, that's kind of some bullish news, but at the same time, the market says, oh, well, we're going to get some stuff out of there for another basically 6 weeks, because at this point, the a 2-month extension, they'll be starting to wind it down again like they did this time. But in general, looking back, or what we might see for next week, I'm kind of anticipating maybe we'll see a little bit of stability here, and that it's not going to be after the kind of liquidation we had in corn and wheat this week, and even beans getting beat up at this point. That's the best we could hope for, is a little stability in here, and maybe end up starting to get concentrated on how this weather system in the U.S. is going to turn out to be. There's still lots of different theories as to about what might happen in the summertime situation here in the U.S. From the standpoint that the El Nino is building, but at the same time, the West Coast cool temperatures could be a barrier in moving some of these more producing weather systems here across the U.S. Central Plains and on into the Western Corn Belt and that. And so we'll have to see how this all comes along. But right now, it's everybody's licking their wounds and hoping that we can kind of go sideways a little bit here and go from there. Last week we talked about making some minor sales here in the end of last year's situation, 10% or so on these things, and wasn't excited about the report and what was out ahead of us here with the crop tour. But it turned out that making some sales here before this last week's plunge was a good move here, when it basically we're at the end of our year of marketing here, so it's time to sometimes just kind of make a sale just because it's time to do it, and it turned out to be the right time last week.
All right. Thank you very much.
You bet. Have a good weekend. And as I mentioned to you earlier, I'm going to make a quick little tour out across northern Illinois, and we'll see what the emergence looks like. It probably will be looking very good for considering we've had some light moisture, but we could definitely use a lot more here in northern Illinois.
Have a safe trip.
You bet. Talk to you.